She believed she held all the authority in the cabin. She believed her word was final. But with one reckless moment, Rachel Monroe shattered her entire career. A senior flight attendant, respected and feared, made a choice she couldn't undo. She slapped an elderly passenger, Clara Jennings, right there in first class, in front of everyone. But Rachel had no idea who she had just laid hands on, because Clara's husband, he owned Skybright Airlines. And now, with the aircraft gliding toward landing at Northcrest International, Rachel wasn't just facing an upset traveler, she was standing on the edge of losing everything. Earlier that afternoon, the terminal at Northcrest buzzed with the usual rush of travelers. The background noise was a mixture of boarding calls, the hum of suitcase wheels, and the distant chime of departure announcements. Among the bustle, Clara Jennings, a woman in her early 70s, moved with the grace of someone completely at ease. She didn't rush, nor did she glance around anxiously like many passengers eager to reach their gates. She had spent decades traveling for both work and family, and the hurried pace of airports no longer fazed her. Wearing a powder blue shawl over a crisp cream dress, with her silver hair neatly pulled into a low bun, Clara carried herself with quiet dignity. She held a modest leather handbag in one hand, and in the other, a small wheeled carry-on. When she arrived at the first-class lane, a young gate agent scanned her boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Jennings. Wishing you a pleasant flight," he said with a warm smile. Clara returned a small nod, her eyes kind but reserved, and made her way down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin had already begun to fill. The faint scent of citrus cleaning spray mixed with hints of perfume and freshly conditioned leather seats. Clara walked calmly to seat 1B, placed her bag neatly below the seat in front of her, and was about to sit when a sharp voice sliced through the quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Clara looked up to see a tall woman in a crisp uniform standing over her. Her name tag read Rachel Monroe, and everything about her, her posture, her narrowed eyes, her tightly pulled back hair, suggested a person used to being obeyed without question. "Yes," Clara replied, her tone polite. Rachel's eyes dropped to the boarding pass still in Clara's hand. "This is first class," she said, enunciating as if explaining something complicated. Clara raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware." Rachel held out her hand. "May I see your ticket?" Without hesitation, Clara handed it to her. Rachel examined it, her jaw tightening as the name and seat assignment matched perfectly. Still, her eyes held doubt. She returned the ticket with a forced smile. Just making sure. Clara nodded slowly. She had seen this kind of scrutiny before, the assumption that she didn't belong, the quiet questioning. It wasn't new, but she wasn't here to argue. She simply sat down, adjusted her shawl, and turned her attention to the window. As the last passengers boarded, the cabin began to quiet. Clara reached into her purse to retrieve a paperback novel when she noticed Rachel returning, her smile tighter, eyes less patient. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Rachel said, "but I need you to move." Clara turned back to her. "Move." Rachel crossed her arms. "There seems to be a mistake. That seat isn't available to you." Clara sat straighter. "My boarding pass says 1B. Rachel exhaled sharply. "Yes, but—" She glanced around as though searching for backup. "This seat is typically reserved for a certain type of traveler." A heavy silence followed. Some passengers shifted, clearly listening now, though pretending not to. Clara inhaled slowly. She had spent her life as an educator, raising generations to speak up, to carry themselves with pride. She wasn't about to shrink. "What kind of traveler am I not?" she asked evenly. Rachel hesitated. "I didn't mean it like that." Clara held up a hand. "If there's an actual problem, I'd like to hear it from the captain." Rachel's jaw clenched. Before she could reply, another voice entered the conversation. "Is there an issue here?" asked a younger flight attendant, her voice cautious. Tina Alvarez, who had been watching from the galley, stepped forward. Unlike Rachel, Tina's expression showed genuine concern. "No problem," Rachel snapped. "I was just asking Mrs. Jennings to relocate." "To where?" Tina asked, frowning. Rachel paused. She hadn't expected resistance from either of them. She had expected Clara to quietly comply. But now, with Tina present and the passengers clearly watching, she felt pressure rising. "The economy section's full," Rachel admitted under her breath. "I'm not moving," Clara said calmly. Rachel's lips drew tight. Her posture stiffened. And then, in a moment that no one could have anticipated, she reached forward, grabbed Clara's arm, and said, "Listen, lady." The slap came quick, loud, shocking. Gasps echoed through the cabin as the sound rang out. A woman up front covered her mouth. A man 2 rows back turned sharply in his seat. The entire first-class section went still. Rachel froze, her hand still midair. Her expression unreadable, part panic, part disbelief. Clara had turned slightly from the force of the slap, but when she looked back at Rachel, her face held no anger, no fear, only disappointment. Tina, pale and speechless, stood frozen by the galley. Clara didn't speak. She simply picked up her phone, tapped out a brief message, then folded her hands neatly in her lap. Rachel stood there, breath quickening, as she realized she had just made the worst mistake of her life, and she had made it very publicly. Passengers remained silent. Some looked away, some kept their heads down, others stared, horrified. One man looked like he was reaching for his phone but hesitated. Tina finally found her voice whispering, "Did you just—" Rachel snapped back to life. "Stay out of this, Tina." The cabin felt suffocating. Clara hadn't touched her cheek. She hadn't protested, but her gaze stayed fixed on Rachel, cool and steady. She had already sent the message, and Rachel Monroe had no idea who was on the other end of that text. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Rachel Monroe glanced nervously around the first-class aisle, noticing a few passengers gripping their phones. Whether they were recording or just avoiding eye contact was unclear. But Clara Jennings didn't need anyone to speak up on her behalf. She'd lived long enough to know exactly how these situations played out. People avoided conflict. They preferred comfort over courage. Rachel adjusted the hem of her blazer as if straightening her appearance could somehow undo what had just happened. "I'm asking you one more time," she said, her voice quieter but still firm. "You need to move." Clara didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Rachel. Rachel's hands clenched at her sides, her frustration now tangled with fear. "Fine," she muttered. "If you won't cooperate, I'll call security." She spun on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane. Tina Alvarez remained frozen beside Clara for a moment, wide-eyed and unsure. Then she slowly knelt beside the older woman. Are you okay?" Clara gave a composed nod. "Yes, dear, I'm fine." Tina hesitated. "Should I alert someone?" Clara glanced down at her phone, the screen still glowing softly. "I already have." Tina blinked, confused. "Who?" Clara only offered a small, knowing smile. She picked up her purse, placed it neatly in her lap, and sat back like nothing had happened. At the front of the aircraft, Rachel reached the intercom outside the cockpit and pressed the button, her tone sharp but controlled. "Captain, we have a situation in first class. A passenger is refusing to vacate a seat that isn't hers. I need ground security to meet us before takeoff." There was a pause, followed by the captain's calm reply through the speaker. "Name of the passenger?" Rachel exhaled, clearly annoyed. "Clara Jennings." Another pause, longer this time. Then the intercom crackled again, but it wasn't the captain's voice that came through. It was lower, firmer, and somehow colder. "This is Harrison Jennings. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Rachel's blood ran cold. Her fingers hovered over the intercom button, but she couldn't press it, couldn't speak. Back in the cabin, Tina exhaled as the realization hit her. She turned to Clara, whispering in disbelief, "Oh, no." Rachel barely managed to speak. "Harrison Jennings?" The voice on the other end didn't waver. "Yes, my wife, Clara Jennings, is the woman you just laid hands on." A ripple of recognition moved through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had previously kept their heads down now sat upright, their eyes wide. Some mouths fell open. Whispers began to stir. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears. Her hands shook as she stepped back from the intercom, horror dawning on her face. She had just slapped the wife of Harrison Jennings, the founder, the owner, the man who had built Skybright Airlines from nothing. Not just a stakeholder, but the name behind the wings. A man with enough influence to fire anyone. On the spot. And she had assaulted his wife. Passengers weren't pretending to be disinterested anymore. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared openly at Rachel, waiting for what would come next. The intercom sparked again. Harrison's voice returned, this time razor sharp. "Ms. Monroe, I asked you a question. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Tina, still beside Clara, glanced toward the front. "Mrs. Jennings, do you want me to go get the captain?" Clara shook her head, calm and composed. "There's no need." She picked up her phone again and sent another brief message, then placed it gently back on the armrest and folded her hands in her lap. She was waiting. Rachel's body tensed. She knew she needed to do something. Anything. She swallowed, forcing professionalism back into her voice, and pressed the intercom again. There's been a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "Mrs. Jennings' seat assignment must have been processed incorrectly. I was only trying to—" She didn't get to finish. Harrison's voice cut her off. "So your response was to lay your hands on her?" Rachel closed her eyes, the reality of it crashing down on her. But the intercom clicked off, and a moment later the cockpit door opened. Out stepped Captain David Marks, his face unreadable, his presence commanding. He was in his late 50s, his gray-streaked hair tucked neatly under his cap. His voice didn't need to rise to be powerful. "Ms. Monroe," he said, quiet and firm, "follow me, now." Rachel's throat tightened. "Captain, He cut her off without even a glance. That wasn't a request. The cabin fell into a hushed silence as Rachel reluctantly turned and followed the captain into the cockpit. Tina slowly stood, eyes darting between Clara and the door that had just closed behind Rachel. She looked down and noticed Clara's phone screen still illuminated, showing a single new message. "Harrison Jennings. Stay seated. I'm handling it." Tina felt her stomach twist. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. Inside the cockpit, Rachel stood stiffly beside the captain's seat, her arms locked at her sides. The space felt claustrophobic, suffocating. Her breaths came shallow. Captain Marks took his seat, his expression carved from stone. The cockpit monitor blinked to life. On the screen appeared Marcus Reed, the airline's flight operations director. His face was grave, eyes hard. Rachel licked her lips and tried to maintain composure. "Captain, I was just trying to follow protocol." "I believe the seat was—" "Be quiet," Captain Marks said flatly, raising a hand. Rachel froze. He rubbed his temple for a long moment, then lowered his hand and fixed her with a stare. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Rachel's heart pounded. She did. Of course she did. But saying it out loud would make it real. "I was just trying to clarify the seating issue," she tried again. "I thought she was in the wrong spot and—" Marcus Reed's voice broke in through the screen, sharp and cold. "You struck the wife of this airline's owner." Rachel winced. Captain Marks leaned forward slightly. "What gave you the right to touch a passenger?" Rachel's voice cracked. I lost my temper." Marcus exchanged a look with the captain, a silent, ominous exchange. "So you're admitting it?" Marcus asked, tone hardening. Rachel's face paled. No, I didn't mean to. It wasn't intentional. I was trying to enforce seating assignments, and that's enough, Captain Marks said. Rachel bit her lip. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. This was about conduct, about power misused, about a decision that had spiraled into a corporate nightmare. Captain Marks sat back in his chair, arms folded. The silence stretched, heavy and final. Orders were already coming down, and Rachel Monroe's career was hanging by a thread. The moment the words left her mouth, Rachel Monroe knew she'd made it worse. No, she stammered, her voice cracking as she scrambled to fix her mistake. It wasn't intentional. I was just trying to enforce the seating chart. She wouldn't listen, and Captain David Marks exhaled sharply, cutting her off with a simple shake of his head. That's enough. Rachel bit her lip, her chest tightening under the weight of her own panic. Captain, please, she tried again. I can apologize. I'll go back out there right now and fix it. Before she could finish, the voice of Marcus Reed, the flight supervisor still on the cockpit screen, broke through the static. Calm, cold, and final. It's too late for that, Miss Monroe. Rachel's hands went cold. Her fingertips trembled. She turned toward Captain Marks, but the look on his face held no hope. Per direct orders from Mr. Jennings, Marks said, his voice low and firm, you're relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Rachel's heart stopped for a beat. What? Marcus's expression didn't change. When this plane touches down, you won't report to crew debriefing. You'll be escorted to administration for a formal review. Rachel's breath hitched. Her knees felt weak. You're suspending me. Captain Marks leaned forward. We don't make the rules here. Harrison Jennings does. Rachel's fingernails dug into the palm of her hand. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick. Marks nodded toward the cabin door. You'll walk back to first class, collect your things, and take the crew jump seat in the rear. You're not to speak to any passengers. Am I clear? Rachel didn't move. She had never been reassigned like a rookie. Not once in her years of flying had she been stripped of command mid-flight. She opened her mouth to protest, but the captain's next words destroyed any argument she had left. If you refuse, he said slowly, I'll have the air marshal remove you. Right now. Rachel's blood ran cold. There was no way out, no spin, no excuse. After a long, shallow breath, she forced a nod. Her hands trembled as she turned and stepped out of the cockpit. Captain Marks didn't watch her leave. Marcus didn't say another word. The door clicked shut behind her. As she walked back through the aisle of first class, it was as though time had slowed. Every head turned, every eye followed her, and every whisper burned. That's her, the one who hit the woman. I saw the captain's face. She's done. Did you hear? They're pulling her from the flight. Rachel kept her gaze fixed forward, her head low, but the shame was inescapable. These were the same passengers she once barked orders at, the same people she'd once corrected for not stowing their luggage fast enough. Now she was walking among them, stripped of authority, reduced to nothing. She reached the attendant's storage bin and pulled her bag out with shaking hands. Her fingers fumbled over the zipper, useless and unsteady. She had spent years working toward seniority, building a reputation, gaining the respect and fear of her peers. Now she was being watched like a scandal, a problem, a failure. Tina Alvarez stood a few feet away, saying nothing, but her face said it all, an unspoken mix of pity, disapproval, and resignation. Rachel turned to leave without meeting her eyes. She walked slowly, deliberately, trying to ignore the heat crawling up her neck. But then, just as she passed the last row of first class, a voice stopped her in her tracks. Ms. Monroe. Her stomach twisted. She didn't need to look to know who had spoken. Clara Jennings was still seated exactly as before. Calm, dignified, unshaken. her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight. She hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded a single thing. Yet she held the cabin in the palm of her hand. Rachel turned slowly. "Yes, Mrs. Jennings?" Clara studied her for a long moment. Then, in a voice as measured as it was devastating, she asked, "Do you still believe I don't belong in this seat?" The words hit harder than the captain's orders, harder than the threat of termination. Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Passengers nearby fell completely silent. All eyes were back on her. Clara's gaze didn't waver. "I'd like an answer." Rachel's body locked up. She knew what she should say, knew she should apologize, should fall on her knees and beg forgiveness. But her pride clawed at her throat. I made a mistake," Rachel finally managed. Clara gave a subtle nod, as if she had expected nothing more. "I hope," she said softly, "it's not one you make again." Rachel's hands clenched tightly around her bag strap. Clara turned back to the window, dismissing her without another word. This time, the reactions weren't hidden. Some passengers looked satisfied. Others shook their heads. One woman whispered, "That was deserved." Rachel turned and continued down the aisle, each step heavier than the last. As she moved past the rows of watching faces, a horrifying thought gripped her. She wasn't afraid of what would happen when they landed. She was afraid of what Harrison Jennings would do next. When she finally reached the back of the plane, Rachel collapsed into the narrow crew jump seat. Her breathing was uneven. Her bag felt heavier than it ever had before. The engine's dull hum filled the silence, but it couldn't quiet the noise in her head. She had never been pulled mid-flight, even during chaotic layovers, even with unruly passengers. She had always held control, always set the tone, enforced the rules. But now, she was a uniformed ghost in the back of the plane. No voice, no authority, no dignity. Tina hovered near the galley, hesitating before finally stepping closer. "You okay?" she asked gently. Rachel clenched her jaw. "I don't need your sympathy." Tina leaned back, arms crossed. "It's not sympathy," she said evenly. "I just don't think you realize how bad this really is." Rachel gave her a hard look. "I know exactly how bad it is." "Do you?" Tina asked, her voice lowering. Rachel didn't respond. "You hit the wife of the man who owns this airline," Tina continued. "This isn't a write-up. This isn't a stern meeting behind closed doors. You're not getting a warning." She shook her head. "You're getting erased." Rachel stiffened. "They can't just fire me without a process." Tina let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "This isn't normal, Rachel. This isn't about a seat mix-up, Rachel." Tina Alvarez's voice was calm, but edged with something sharp, something final. "You put your hands on someone, and not just anyone, Clara Jennings." Rachel Monroe opened her mouth, ready to push back, but no words came out. What was there to say? What defense could she offer? Tina leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You still don't get it, do you?" She didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She just sat there and sent one text. She let that settle between them before adding, "And now you're sitting in the back of the plane, stripped of everything." Rachel's throat went dry. That was the one thought she'd been trying to suppress, the one thing she wasn't ready to admit, because deep down she knew who Harrison Jennings was. He wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. Rachel clenched her teeth. Maybe I can still fix it." Tina raised an eyebrow. "How?" Rachel inhaled, as much to convince herself as to answer Tina. "Maybe if I apologize, really apologize, he won't push for termination." Tina tilted her head. "You think an apology's enough?" Rachel paused. She wanted to believe that. But something about the way Harrison had spoken over the intercom, so cold, so in control, told her that this wasn't about words anymore. Tina glanced toward the front of the plane. "If I were you, I'd hope for a miracle. Rachel stared forward, her hands clenched in her lap, and for the first time in her long career, she truly understood. She had made a mistake she couldn't fix. The plane flew on smooth and steady, but the tension inside the cabin was thick and heavy. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands, occasionally glancing toward first class, where Clara Jennings sat unmoved, composed, silent, dignified. Something had shifted. People who had ignored her earlier were now noticing her. A few looked guilty, as if just realizing the injustice they had silently witnessed. But Clara didn't need their apologies. She had already done what needed to be done. She had sent one text. Up in the cockpit, Captain David Marks kept a firm grip on the controls, his face composed, his jaw set. Beside him, his co-pilot glanced toward the center console, where a flashing alert signaled a new message from the airline's executive team. The co-pilot tapped the screen, reading the note aloud. Security detail will meet the aircraft at the gate. All personnel involved in the incident are to report for immediate review, by order of Harrison Jennings. The co-pilot leaned back, letting out a long breath. That doesn't sound good. Marks didn't take his eyes off the flight path. Not for Monroe, it doesn't. Moments later, the radio crackled again. Captain Marks, this is ground control. Mr. Jennings has requested to be patched through to the flight directly. The co-pilot blinked and looked at the captain. You ready for this? Marks nodded. Patch him in. There was a pause, then the voice came through. Deep, calm, dangerous. This is Harrison Jennings. The co-pilot stiffened. His fingers froze over the navigation controls. Captain Marks cleared his throat. Mr. Jennings, this is Captain Marks. I assume you've been briefed? I have, Harrison replied. His tone was unreadable, neither angry nor emotional. I want confirmation that the flight attendant has been removed from duty. She has, Marks answered. She's been relocated to the crew section and stripped of all responsibilities for the remainder of the flight. There was a long pause. Then Harrison spoke again. When you land, she is to be escorted directly to the administrative office. No stopovers, no crew debriefing. I expect a full incident report before she leaves the airport. Understood, sir, Marks said, exchanging a glance with the co-pilot. One more thing, Harrison added. Marks straightened. Yes, sir? Another pause. Then, in a voice so sharp it seemed to pierce the very air of the cockpit, Harrison said, Tell Ms. Monroe to enjoy her last flight. The line clicked off. Silence. The co-pilot let out a breath, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't say, last flight of the day. No, Marks replied grimly, adjusting the controls. He didn't. Back in the rear crew seat, Rachel sat frozen. She had heard every word. Her ears were ringing, her heart pounding. Those 5 words, enjoy your last flight, played over and over in her mind like a haunting refrain. She gripped the armrests, her nails digging into the fabric. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be ending like this. She'd handled difficult passengers before. She'd clashed with superiors. She'd stood her ground more times than she could count. But this wasn't just another disciplinary talk. This was Harrison Jennings, the man behind every winged emblem on every sky-bright uniform, and he was overseeing her removal personally. Tina stood nearby, fiddling with beverage carts she didn't need to touch. She had heard the intercom too. Everyone had. She hadn't said anything, but the way she refused to meet Rachel's eyes said enough. Rachel's voice cracked when she finally spoke. He can't just fire me on the spot. Tina sighed and turned toward her, arms crossed. Dan, Rachel. Do you seriously think you're keeping this job after what just happened? Rachel clenched her jaw. There has to be a review, a hearing. There's a process. Tina shook her head slowly. Not for this. Rachel's stomach turned. Tina leaned closer. You really think this is just another HR complaint? You didn't just offend a customer. You didn't misplace a drink tray. You assaulted a passenger. Her voice dropped lower, almost pitying. And not just any passenger. She gestured toward the front. Clara Jennings. Rachel looked away. She didn't yell, Tina continued. She didn't call for security. She didn't even raise her voice. Tina's voice grew softer, almost reverent. She just sent one message. And now the most powerful man in the airline industry has already sealed your fate. Rachel pressed a hand to her chest. The pressure was unbearable. This wasn't a rough patch. This was the end. And it was unfolding at 35,000 feet. Up front, Clara sat exactly where she had been from the start, quiet, composed, looking out the window as if none of this concerned her. She could feel the shift in the air, though. She could sense the passengers around her, some watching her with new respect, others with shame for not speaking up sooner. She didn't need their validation. One text had done all the talking. Rachel Monroe sat quietly, staring at the floor of the rear galley, her knuckles white from how tightly she clutched the edge of her seat. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. This couldn't be how it ended. She took a shaky breath, sat up straighter, and turned toward Tina Alvarez, her voice trembling. Maybe there's still one last chance. Tina raised an eyebrow. Now? Rachel nodded quickly and stood, though her legs felt heavy, her balance unsteady. If I go to Mrs. Jennings, if I admit I was wrong, maybe, her voice trailed off. Maybe Harrison Jennings would hear about it. Maybe he'd reconsider. Maybe she could salvage something. Without waiting for approval, Rachel turned and began the long walk toward the front of the plane. Each step was harder than the last. It felt like she was dragging 100 pounds of shame and fear behind her. When she reached the first-class cabin and stopped beside Clara Jennings, she realized something. Clara didn't even look up. She was facing the window, completely serene, as though Rachel's presence didn't deserve acknowledgement. Rachel swallowed hard, hands twisting together in front of her. "Mrs. Jennings?" she said, forcing a polite tone. No response. Passengers nearby turned their heads, some subtly, others without shame. Everyone felt it, the weight in the air, the tension hanging in silence. Rachel pressed on. "Mrs. Jennings, I wanted to apologize." Clara turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her, but not enough to meet her eyes. Her face gave nothing away, no anger, no softness, not even interest. It was like Rachel didn't exist. Rachel took a breath. "I realize I acted inappropriately. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, and I definitely shouldn't have—" Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to finish. "I shouldn't have put my hands on you." Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Indifferent. And somehow, that was worse than anger. Rachel tried again, desperation creeping in. "I regret what I did. It was unprofessional, and I hope you can forgive me." The silence that followed stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Finally, Clara turned to fully face her. Her gaze was steady, sharp, quietly powerful. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "isn't the same as erasing consequences." Rachel's stomach dropped. Clara folded her hands over her lap. "I appreciate your apology, Ms. Monroe. But let me ask you something. Are you apologizing because you're truly sorry?" Her gaze narrowed. "Or because you got caught?" Rachel's throat tightened. She could feel the stares now, dozens of eyes watching her every breath, every word. Clara raised a single finger. "Before you answer, think very carefully. Because if you say the wrong thing right now, it will be the last thing you say as an employee of this airline." Rachel's heart slammed against her chest. The pressure in the air was unbearable. Clara wasn't shouting. She wasn't threatening her. And yet her words weighed more than anything Rachel had ever heard. This was it, the moment. Rachel could lie, pretend she had learned something, try to save herself, or she could tell the truth and risk everything. She clenched her fists, steadying herself. "I'm sorry," she said finally, voice lower, more sincere. "Not just because I got caught, because I was wrong." Clara didn't flinch. Her expression didn't shift. Rachel's voice cracked as she added, "I should have treated you with respect. I should have thought before I acted. And I didn't. I regret that deeply." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then, at last, she tilted her head slightly, considering her. Rachel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Clara would speak to her husband. Maybe she'd advocate on her behalf. But then Clara gave a soft sigh and shook her head, just slightly. Rachel's hope vanished in an instant. "I believe you regret it," Clara said gently, "but I don't believe you've learned from it." Rachel's breath hitched. "What?" Clara lifted her hand and gestured toward her purse. "I'm not the one you need to convince." She tapped her phone once and slid it back into her bag. "And I've already said everything I needed to say." Rachel stood there frozen. That was it. Her final shot gone. Her hands began to sweat, her vision blurring just slightly as the panic rushed back in. She had thought if she just apologized, if she lowered herself, it would be enough. But Clara Jennings had never been the one holding the knife over her career. Harrison Jennings was, and he was already waiting on the ground. Rachel took a shaky step backward. Her legs felt like they might collapse under her. She turned slowly and began walking back to the rear of the cabin. As she passed the rows, the whispers started again, this time louder, less subtle. "She's finished. I almost feel bad for her. Almost." Rachel's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't ready to give up, but she knew the truth. The moment the plane touched down, she wouldn't have a choice. The descent began, the aircraft tilting ever so slightly downward. Passengers started shifting in their seats, fastening belts as the overhead announcement reminded them to prepare for landing. But Rachel couldn't hear any of it. All she could hear was her heartbeat, racing, frantic. She sat stiffly in the crew jump seat once more, eyes fixed on the floor, fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of her skirt. She had lost control completely. Her thoughts churned. Could she call someone, write an email, spin it as a misunderstanding? Could she still salvage even a piece of her career? But no matter how she twisted the story in her head, she always came back to the same conclusion. There was no escape. Not from this. She had tried to apologize. She had swallowed her pride. And it hadn't mattered. Harrison Jennings had already made his decision. At the galley, Tina stood near the beverage cart, watching Rachel from a distance. She had seen plenty of crew members fall out of line before, seen them written up, reprimanded, benched. But this was different. This was a career-ending storm, and Rachel was sitting in its eye. Tina hesitated, then stepped forward. "Hey!" Rachel didn't look up. Tina sighed. "You tried, huh?" Rachel nodded slowly. Didn't work. Another nod. Tina leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I've seen bad before, but this, I don't think you can come back from this." Rachel's lips parted, her voice dry and distant. "You think I'm done?" Tina didn't answer right away. She just stared ahead, her voice quieter this time. "If I were you, I'd brace for what's waiting at the gate. Are you okay?" Tina Alvarez's voice was gentle, but Rachel Monroe only responded with a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "No," she said flatly, "not even close." Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she rubbed at her eyes, trying to keep the panic from fully overtaking her. "Maybe I can still talk to him," she whispered. "Maybe if I explain that it was all just what?" Tina cut in quietly but firmly. Rachel looked up, startled by the sharpness in her tone. Tina's expression was unreadable. "What are you going to say? That it was a misunderstanding? That you were just following procedure?" Rachel opened her mouth, but Tina tilted her head. "Because that's not going to work, and you know it." Rachel swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her voice hoarse from holding back panic. "Of course I get it." Tina shook her head slowly. "I don't think you do." She crossed her arms, her eyes steady. "You didn't just mix up a seat. You looked at her, Clara Jennings, and decided right there that she didn't belong in first class." Rachel flinched. "That's not—" Tina raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it?" Silence. Rachel said nothing because, deep down, they both knew the truth. Tina let out a sigh, rubbing her temple. "I don't think you meant for it to go this far, but it did, and that means you need to own it." Rachel exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Even if I do, it won't matter. I'm done. Aren't I?" Tina didn't reply. She didn't need to, because they both already knew. A low rumble passed through the plane as the landing gear dropped into place. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Rachel sat still in her jump seat, barely breathing. Her hands clenched tightly around her uniform. The fabric beneath her fingers felt rough, constricting. This was it. For years she had walked these cabins like they belonged to her. She made announcements, issued orders, demanded respect. Now she was silent, powerless, a passenger herself. No, not a passenger, a problem, a warning. The plane touched down with a soft bump, rolling smoothly along the runway. Some passengers gave a polite clap, the reflex of 1,000 landings. But to Rachel, it sounded mocking. She barely noticed the slowing taxi. Her thoughts were elsewhere, spinning, clawing at possibilities that didn't exist. Then came the final announcement. "Welcome to Eastbridge International Airport. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying Skybright." Ding! The chime cut through Rachel's thoughts like a blade. This was really happening. Tina gave her a glance, sympathetic but quiet, and moved forward to begin deplaning. But this wouldn't be a normal deplaning. Everyone knew it. Passengers stood, retrieving luggage from overhead bins, stretching stiff limbs from the long flight. Some hurried to exit, but many lingered, waiting, watching. Rachel forced herself to stand, her body resisting every movement. Her legs felt like concrete, and then she saw it. Standing just beyond the open plane door, framed by the entrance to the jet bridge, was a group of Skybright executives, faces grim, posture rigid. In the center, poised and unreadable, stood Harrison Jennings. His suit was sharp, his stance relaxed, but his presence undeniable, the kind of presence that made a person's knees buckle without a word. But it wasn't just him. 2 uniformed security officers stood at either side of the executives, hands folded calmly in front of them, their expressions stoic. They weren't here to escort a VIP. They were here to remove someone. Gasps and whispers spread through the cabin. Some passengers froze. Others leaned to get a better look. Clara Jennings remained perfectly composed, calmly zipping her carry-on bag with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove. Rachel's face drained of color. This wasn't a hearing. This wasn't a quiet discussion. This was a public reckoning. Rachel stood rooted to the spot, her body refusing to move. The plane door had transformed into a gaping mouth, ready to swallow her whole. Harrison hadn't moved. He didn't need to. The executives around him didn't speak. They didn't need to. The passengers in first class turned their full attention toward the scene, openly staring now. Some tried to mask their interest with subtle glances. Others didn't bother. Even those who had ignored everything earlier knew. This wasn't a standard landing. This was a message. Rachel swallowed hard and forced herself to step forward. Her legs felt foreign, her limbs stiff, robotic. At the galley, Tina stood silently, watching. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because she knew, too. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was Harrison Jennings making an example. Rachel's chest constricted. Maybe, just maybe. If she said something first, it would soften the blow. If she could explain, if she could show remorse. But before she could speak, Harrison Jennings stepped forward, with the quiet precision of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command attention. He moved to the edge of the cabin. His eyes locked onto hers. Ms. Monroe. Rachel's stomach dropped. His tone wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel, but it sliced through the silence with precision. She straightened instinctively, as if posture might shield her from what was coming. "Mr. Jennings," she said, trying to keep her voice even. He didn't blink. He didn't soften. He wasn't here to hear excuses. "I assume," he said, his tone calm and deadly, "you know why I'm here." Rachel nodded, though the motion felt like it might tear her in half. "I do." Her fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to plead, to bargain, but she knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. This wasn't about what she said now. This was about what she had already done. "I understand there was an issue," Rachel Monroe said, her voice tight as she tried to compose herself. "And I deeply regret any misunderstanding with your—" Harrison Jennings lifted his hand. "Stop." Rachel's words died in her throat. Harrison's gaze locked onto hers. Cold, calculated, controlled. "This isn't about misunderstandings," he said, his tone sharper than steel. "And I don't care what you regret." The entire plane had gone silent. Flight attendants froze mid-step. Passengers paused mid-exit. Even Captain Marks, who had stepped into the aisle from the cockpit, stood completely still. Rachel felt like the floor beneath her had vanished. Harrison shook his head slowly. "What I care about," he continued, "is why you thought you had the authority to put your hands on a passenger." Her heart slammed against her chest. He had gone straight for the core, the undeniable truth. Rachel opened her mouth, desperate to explain, to say something that would change what was coming, but her thoughts were a blur. There was no excuse that could make it right. There was no version of the story that would protect her now. Her hesitation was all the answer Harrison needed. He turned toward one of the nearby executives, nodding once. "Effective immediately," he said calmly, "Rachel Monroe is permanently dismissed from Skybright Airlines." The words hit her like a blow to the gut. Rachel gasped softly. "Wait." Harrison raised a hand again, not to silence her, but to cut through her panic. "We're not done." Rachel's knees threatened to give out beneath her. "You are to be escorted directly from this flight," he continued. "Your contract is terminated, and your employment record will reflect dismissal due to conduct violation." Behind her, murmurs began to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others whispered without shame. Rachel's pulse raced. "Mr. Jennings, please." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. There was no sympathy in his expression, no second chance hidden in his eyes. Just finality. And then, for the first time, a flicker of something else. Amusement. It chilled her more than anger ever could. "You want another chance?" he asked, his voice deceptively gentle. She nodded frantically. "I do. I really do." He studied her for a long moment. And then he chuckled, a sound so quiet, so cutting, that it silenced even the whispers. "You had your chance," he said, "the moment you saw my wife and decided she didn't belong." Rachel's breath caught. Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough for only her to hear. "You could have stopped at asking about her seat," he murmured. "You could have stopped at checking her boarding pass." His tone hardened. "But you didn't. You made a choice, Ms. Monroe." Rachel stood trembling. "You thought you had power over her," he said. "Now you have none." She felt like the world was collapsing in on her. Even if she left this plane, even if she tried to apply somewhere else, this moment would follow her. Her name would be flagged, her reputation destroyed. No airline would touch her again. Harrison stepped back and gave a single nod to the security officers. "Escort her out." Rachel's knees buckled slightly. One of the officers stepped forward, gesturing, not aggressively, but firmly. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Phones were out now. Passengers were recording. Some whispered. Some didn't bother to hide their stares. Rachel's face burned with humiliation. This was more than a dismissal. This was a public execution of everything she had built. As she stepped past the last row of first class, a voice stopped her cold. "I hope you remember this." Clara Jennings didn't turn her head. She was still gazing out the window, calm, unbothered. Rachel froze. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, but she kept walking. She couldn't look back. Not now. Not ever. The jet bridge was cold, the air stale and suffocating. Rachel's legs felt like they were made of stone as she stumbled forward. The two security officers flanked her but kept their distance. No one grabbed her. No one needed to. She had already been stripped of everything that gave her authority. Every step felt like another brick being added to the weight on her shoulders. In the distance, the airport bustled like normal. Rolling bags, overhead announcements, chatter from other gates. But in Rachel's ears, it all sounded far away, drowned out by the echo of Harrison Jennings' voice. You had a chance. She had, and she'd thrown it away with one slap. At the end of the jet bridge, a small group stood waiting. The administrative team. At the center, a woman in a crisp navy suit stood poised with a tablet. Her badge read, Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Operations Manager. She didn't smile. She barely looked at Rachel. "She's coming with me," Rebecca said, nodding to one of the guards. Rachel opened her mouth. But Rebecca had already turned, expecting her to follow. Rachel swallowed her pride and obeyed. The walk through the terminal was its own punishment. Some passengers rushed past, unaware, but a few, just a few, recognized her. The way their eyes widened, the subtle nudges, the quiet, not-so-secret photos snapped under the guise of checking phones. Rachel kept her head down. She had been the enforcer once, the gatekeeper of rules, the one who issued write-ups and warnings. Now, she was the story, the headline. The woman who had slapped the airline owner's wife mid-flight and got dragged off the plane. She was the scandal, the viral video, the mistake. Rachel's throat tightened. Her fingers dug into her palms. This couldn't be happening, but it was, and she had done it to herself. She thought back to when she first saw Clara Jennings, the moment she assumed, without question, that this woman didn't belong. She hadn't questioned her training. She hadn't checked her own bias. She had acted with arrogance, and now she was walking past the gates like a passenger with no ticket, no title, and no future. Maybe, just maybe, if she acted like she still had control, she could claw back a sliver of dignity. Rachel Monroe walked stiffly behind Rebecca Lynn, the Senior Flight Operations Manager, into a private elevator. Rebecca swiped her badge and the doors slid shut, sealing them inside. The silence was thick. Rachel adjusted her posture, trying to find a piece of her former professionalism. "Ms. Lynn," she began, her voice even, trained, familiar, "I understand that Mr. Jennings is upset. I take full responsibility for what happened." And Rebecca exhaled sharply through her nose, finally lifting her eyes from the tablet in her hands. "Ms. Monroe," she said coolly, "this isn't a disciplinary hearing." Rachel frowned. I understand, but there is no review, no formal process, no panel to defend yourself before." Rebecca angled the tablet slightly toward her. "It's already over." Rachel's heart slammed against her chest as she saw what was on the screen, her termination letter. Already drafted, already signed, already official. Her hands shook as she reached for it, eyes scanning the harsh, bold letters that declared her employment terminated effective immediately. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "There has to be." Rebecca didn't let her finish. "You are permanently banned from working for this airline." Rachel felt the words punch straight through her. Rebecca's finger slid to the next page. And per direct order from Mr. Jennings, your employment file has been flagged. Rachel blinked. Flagged. A permanent mark, Rebecca said. It will show up in every industry database, every background check, every airline under our global hiring network. Rachel's blood ran cold. She had heard of these flags. Rare. Devastating. Used only in the most extreme cases. It wasn't a termination, it was a blacklisting. Rebecca met her gaze. Firm, but not cruel. You will not be hired by any carrier affiliated with Skybright or our parent company. Your name has already been circulated. She glanced at the screen again. That includes over 40 airlines worldwide. Rachel's vision blurred. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her entire career. The elevator gave a soft ding, and Rebecca spoke once more. You'll be escorted to the crew office to retrieve your belongings. After that, you'll proceed directly to the terminal exit. Your uniform and badge will be collected before you leave. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. What was there to say? Rebecca tapped her tablet once, sealing the documents, then looked up one last time. You are never to board one of our planes again, she said flatly. The elevator doors slid open. 2 additional security officers stood waiting. Rachel took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Each step was heavier than the last. The hallway beyond was sleek, sterile. Frosted glass offices lined the walls, each one housing administrators, training managers, scheduling staff, people Rachel used to know, people who used to respect her. Some of them saw her now. Their eyes widened slightly. They saw the security detail flanking her. They knew. Some looked at her with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. Rachel had made her share of enemies, crew members she belittled, rookies she scolded for minor infractions, staff she had written up for personal reasons more than professional ones. She had demanded obedience, and now she was the one being marched through the halls like a cautionary tale. Her throat burned as she approached the crew administration office. The receptionist barely glanced at her before pressing a button beneath the desk. Moments later, a door opened. Ethan Voss stepped out, holding a manila folder. Rachel recognized him vaguely, one of the newer supervisors, still fresh-faced, still earning his place in the hierarchy. On any other day, she might have dismissed him entirely. Today, he was the one finalizing her end. Ms. Monroe, he said, giving a stiff nod to the guards. We'll complete the termination process inside. Rachel hesitated, not out of resistance, just disbelief. Yesterday she had been managing the crew, calling the shots, reviewing flight plans. Now she was being processed like a liability. She followed him into a small, windowless room. The door clicked shut behind her. The room was cold, quiet, unforgiving. Rachel sat stiffly across from Ethan, who slid the folder across the table. The papers inside were thick. Policies, conduct violations, legal jargon. At the top, in bold black letters, termination of employment. Effective immediately. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. Ethan's voice was calm, rehearsed. By signing this, you acknowledge your removal from Skybright Airlines due to conduct violations, specifically inappropriate physical contact with a passenger. The words echoed in her head. A passenger, not the owner's wife. Just a passenger. But that made it even worse. She had broken the one rule everyone knew never to touch. Rachel's chest tightened as she looked down at the form. This was real. This was final. Ethan continued. You also acknowledge that you will not pursue reinstatement or apply for any position within the Skybright network or its affiliates. Rachel looked up. There has to be a way to appeal this. A review. Something. Ethan didn't blink. There's not. It wasn't cruel. It was just policy. But policy backed by power. Harrison Jennings' power was unbreakable. Rachel forced herself to sign. Each stroke of the pen felt like a nail in the coffin of the identity she had built over a decade. Ethan checked the signature and tucked the folder away. Next, you'll turn in your uniform and company badge. Rachel hesitated. The uniform had been her armor, her symbol of control. She had worn it with pride, strutted through airports with a commanding presence, and now she was about to strip it away, like it never mattered. It felt final the moment she signed her name. Rachel Monroe had spent years writing up reports, drafting suspensions, enforcing rules. She had watched others get walked out for mistakes far smaller than her own. But she had never imagined being on this side of the table. Never. Across from her, Ethan Voss remained professional, almost cold. "You also acknowledge that you will not seek reinstatement," he said, "nor will you apply for any airline affiliated with our parent company." Rachel could hardly hear him. Her vision blurred. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a firing. It was a complete blacklisting. Just a few days ago, she had been working elite routes, managing first-class service, handling celebrities and CEOs. Now she would be lucky if she ever worked again. Her voice came out like a whisper, fragile and uncertain. "Is there any way to appeal this?" Ethan didn't even flinch. No. The word was final. She stared at the thick stack of papers on the table, her fingers trembling as she signed the last page. Every line she wrote felt like she was erasing herself. Ethan collected the folder without a word. He opened a drawer and placed it inside. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, he said, "You'll need to return your uniform and your employee badge before leaving." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The uniform. The one she had worn with pride. The one that had made her feel like she mattered, like she had authority, like she belonged to something bigger. That uniform had been her armor. Ethan must have noticed her hesitation. "There's a changing room down the hall," he said quietly. A security officer stepped forward, standing near the door, not forcing her, just waiting. But the message was clear. She had no choice. Rachel stood stiffly, her fists clenched at her sides, and walked out of the office. The hallway felt longer than before. She passed by employees who used to greet her with a respectful nod. Now some looked away. Others stared. A few whispered, and they all knew. She reached the changing room, stepped inside, and locked the door behind her. For the first time since this nightmare began, her body shook uncontrollably. This was the final step. Her hands were numb as she reached up and unpinned her name badge. She stared at it. The silver and blue medal that once announced her presence with authority. That told the world who she was. She placed it gently on the counter. Then she slid out of her uniform, piece by piece, each movement slow, robotic, like her mind had left her body. The blazer, the blouse, the scarf she always knotted with precision, the pants she had tailored just right, the sensible heels she wore like battle boots. It all felt like a costume now, and she no longer had the right to wear it. When she stepped back into the hallway, she wasn't Rachel Monroe, senior flight attendant. She was just Rachel, and she had never felt smaller. Back at the office, she handed over the folded uniform and her badge. Ethan took them without speaking. Then he nodded to the guards. "She's done here." Rachel flinched at the phrasing. Done here. Like she was just another issue resolved, a report filed, a mess cleaned up. One of the security officers gestured toward the exit. "This way, Ms. Monroe." She turned slowly, forcing herself to keep her back straight. At the very least, she could walk out with her head held high. But as she stepped through the terminal, the whispers started again. Passengers from her flight were still around. They remembered her. They had seen her humiliation. They knew she had been fired, shamed, erased. She kept walking. Her heels echoed faintly on the polished floor. Her mind was numb, and she knew No matter where she went, no matter how long it had been, this would follow her. Her name, her face, this moment, they would remember. The sliding glass doors opened with a quiet whoosh, letting in the rush of late afternoon air. Rachel stepped outside. The cold air hit her skin like a slap. She stopped on the curb. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. She stood there, gripping the strap of her purse, until her knuckles went white, staring out at the blur of activity. Taxis pulled up and honked. Shuttles zipped by. Travelers bustled about, some reuniting with family, others rushing to make connections, still more arriving from distant cities, with dreams, plans, hopes. Life was moving on. But for Rachel, time had stopped. For years, everything had been structured, controlled. Her schedule, her rotations, her flights, her assignments. She had always known her next move. And now there was nothing. Her career was over. Her name was stained in every airline system. She couldn't even walk into an airport without that flag coming up. She had been erased from the very world she helped manage. Rachel turned slowly, glancing back at the building behind her. The airport, her airport, the one she had once walked through with confidence, where she'd been the one in charge, where everyone knew her name. Now it had spit her out like trash. She had believed she was untouchable, that her seniority, her authority, her experience would protect her, that passengers had no power, that they existed to follow her rules, to sit where she told them, to obey. And then came Clara Jennings, a woman who didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't threaten. She had simply waited, silent, dignified, and with one quiet text, Clara had unraveled everything. Rachel let out a shaky breath. Where did she go now? What did she even do? Her identity had been wrapped around her job, her uniform, her role. Without it, what was left? She took a step forward, and with each movement, the truth hit harder. She was no longer a flight attendant. She was no longer respected. She was no longer in control. She was just Rachel. And she had nowhere to go. The world around her moved in fast forward. Rachel Monroe stood frozen on the curb outside the terminal, her hands clenched around the strap of her bag, the icy air biting her cheeks. For years she had walked this exact pavement with purpose, confident, respected, uniformed. She had passed through private doors with a badge that opened everything. She had never been just another person standing outside. Now she was. A taxi rolled to a slow stop in front of her. The driver leaned over, window down. "Need a ride, ma'am?" Rachel blinked, her brain lagging behind her body. She thought about saying yes, about telling him to just drive, anywhere far from this place, far from the shame, far from the eyes that had watched her fall. But then, the weight of it hit her all over again. She had nowhere to go. No plan, no backup. Her entire life had revolved around this job, this airline, this identity, and that world had shut its doors in her face forever. She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm good." The driver shrugged and pulled away, his tail lights disappearing into the endless churn of airport traffic. Rachel stayed rooted to the spot. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hesitated, trembling slightly, before unlocking the screen. No messages, no missed calls, no "are you okay?" from co-workers, no support, no loyalty. It was as if she had never worked there at all. She gritted her teeth and opened her contacts. There were names in there, plenty of them. People she had worked with, mentored, shared flights with, supervisors she had trained under, pilots who once invited her to after-hour lounges, crew members who once turned to her for help. Surely someone would pick up. Her finger hovered over the name of a former manager, someone who had always praised her work ethic, someone she once trained from scratch. She tapped call. It rang twice. Then, "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." Her chest tightened. She tried another, straight to voicemail. Another, and another. Nothing. She felt her breathing start to pick up, faster, tighter. Like the panic that had been waiting at the edge of her thoughts was now rushing in. They were already shutting her out. The industry was small. News traveled fast. Harrison Jennings hadn't just removed her from Skybright. He had made sure she would never work in aviation again. She pressed another name, this one a friend, or so she thought. Someone who once told her, "You've got my back, I've got yours." The phone connected. Her heart leapt. "Hey, it's me," she said quickly. I need to talk." Something happened. There was a pause on the other end. Long, uncomfortable. Then came the voice. Quiet, uncertain. Rachel. Just the way they said her name made her stomach twist. "What's wrong?" she asked, forcing a shaky laugh. "You sound weird." A soft sigh. I don't think I can be involved in this," they said gently. "I heard what happened. I think it's best if I keep my distance." Rachel's world stopped. "Wait!" She started, but the line had already gone dead. She stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open. One by one, the names in her phone blurred into meaninglessness. The people she once called team, colleagues, even friends, gone. The network she had built, the loyalty she had demanded, the power she thought was hers. All of it vanished. Her hands dropped to her sides, limp. She had spent years ensuring she was respected, that people feared her, that they followed her orders without question. She had silenced people, dismissed their concerns, brushed off their discomfort. She had assumed she was above them. And now, when she needed someone, anyone, they were gone. She stood there alone on the sidewalk of the terminal she used to call her kingdom, reaching out to people who wouldn't even pick up. Watching the life she had built dissolve into ash. A thought, dark and quiet, crept into her mind. What if this is it? What if this wasn't just the end of her career? What if it was the end of everything? Her identity had been wrapped around that job, that badge, that title. Without it, who was she? A gust of wind cut through her coat, stinging her skin like a slap. She looked up, her eyes landing on the terminal glass above. The logo of the airline still gleamed there, proud and polished. Skybright Airlines. But it didn't belong to her anymore. It never had. And as she turned away, walking into the unknown, she realized something far worse than losing her job. She had lost herself.